presenter today, Dr. Enoch Hale, is a fellow at the Foundation and Center for Critical Thinking. With over 15 years of instructional experience and having facilitated over 100 professional development workshops, Dr. Hale brings a wealth of experience to the professional development setting. Recognizing the importance of placing critical thinking at the heart of instruction early on in his teaching career, Dr. Hale took an incremental but systematic approach to bringing critical thinking theory and practice into his courses. He's highly skilled in designing lessons that fulfill curriculum standards, and he has extensive experience working with diverse student populations. As an instructor and a presenter, his approach is both practical and personal and is always focused on finding realistic ways to help students develop critical thinking skills and dispositions. Dr. Hale holds a bachelor's degree in intellectual and social history, a master's degree in liberal arts and sciences, a secondary single-subject teaching credential in social science, and a PhD in interdisciplinary studies, with an emphasis on critical thinking, teaching, and learning. His research interests involve identifying practical methods for teachers and students to identify and work through complex issues and problems, as well as studying approaches to professional development and instructor preparation. He regularly conducts national and international workshops for primary, secondary, and post-secondary faculty on topics related to critical thinking and instructional and curriculum design. He teaches a graduate course on critical thinking and has been a presenter at the annual International Conference on Critical Thinking for the last 6 years, and we are very happy that he's here with us today.
Is this on? All right. Let me change over to my slides here. Now, I'm always trying to reinvent how I think about things. And with that said, in preparation for today, I thought, what can I do in an hour? What can be addressed in an hour? I mean, most of this I've taught entire courses on, or when I do a professional development workshop, it's a minimum of 6 hours. So what are we really going to address today? And let me start out by telling you my point of view, my orientation. I think I'm a person of practice. If an idea can't be applied, it doesn't mean too much to me. Abstractions are nice. Take the word analyze, for example. That's a very nice abstract word. It's a word that's thrown around constantly. Yet, when you press people to say, how would you define that in a way that I can actually implement it in a systematic manner? Kind of fall apart. We kind of let the context guide us, but most of that is intuitive. And so, I'm going to talk today about some foundational concepts. If you take this big idea of critical thinking, which is overly used and abused in education, we take it, though, and synthesize with scholars across the disciplines. When they talk about critical thinking, what they have in common, we're going to talk about some of those foundational commonalities today. And I think, more importantly, however, hopefully by the end of today, just in this hour, we're going to walk away with a few concrete things that we can do on a typical day, whether it's talking with our kids or our own children or in the classroom, so that we can see that thought not applied, there's a sense in which thought not applied is useless. And I want students to understand that. So with that said, I'm going to start today, jumping back and forth between how I wanted to start, but since I heard a number of things that were being addressed in terms of what we're going to do in the classroom, how we're expecting students to analyze, evaluate, synthesize, gather information, evaluate the quality of that information in those sources. All right, well, I'm going to give you an example here of, this is a prompt that's taken from a 3rd grade math book, a chapter on subtraction. So when I look at this prompt, this is just standard, right? Just standard. It's like there are 12 Christmas trees and 5 are cut down, how many are left standing? All right, what are some of the problems with this? First of all. Yeah, I mean, are all the trees standing, or 5 standing, or 5 cut down and the others are standing? What are the settlement conditions? And this resonates with me because there was a study done that I read about, a professor at Berkeley named Alan Schoenfeld, who was involved in the study and was reading about it, and where they gave 4th grade students a standardized math test and introduce some research questions, and many of these research questions be considered trick questions, right? So question, 4th grade, there's the math section focused on, well, you have a shepherd and he has 21 white sheep and 11 black sheep. What's the age of the shepherd? All right, yeah. It's easy to pick on 4th graders. Well, what they found was students in the 90th percentile came up with a calculation. More striking, though, was they found that the higher grades they had in math, the greater probability they had of coming up with a calculation. So their grade performance in math was not really a good indicator of how they were reasoning through the problem. So in like technical terms, we could say, well, they didn't identify the settlement conditions. Yeah, it's a trick question, right? But it becomes a little bit more complicated when students would default to the type of operation they were studying just prior to taking the test. So if they were studying subtraction or division, they divide or subtract, things like that. So Schoenfeld said, well, all right, 4th graders, fine, but will this happen with college-level physics students? And he found that the same thing happened. He gave them a Chapter 6 test, 5 questions on the test. Questions 1 through 4 came from Chapter 6. Question 5 came from Chapter 1. And the students in the 85th to 90th percentile came up with a calculation. They forced Chapter 6 thinking and content on answering Chapter 1 question. So he said, now, there's a lot of variables at play here. But what's fundamentally happening? We're not looking at what the question's asking us to do. So from an instructor's point of view, if I give students unclear questions, there's a value to that. If I help them see that it's an unclear question, right? So I regularly give my students unclear questions. And the expectation is that before you set out to solve it, you have to figure out what it's asking you to do, right? Now, so when on a different point too, when I look at what critical thinking means, I'm asking myself, what are students reasoning through? What are they trying to figure out, right? And so I think one way to look at this is, what intellectual moves does this assignment initiate? What I mean by an intellectual move, imagine a chessboard. If your goal is to play chess, actually play the game, you're not just randomly moving pieces about. No, you're consciously and strategically moving pieces about, thinking about the implications of each move. And good chess players don't think 1 move ahead. They don't think 5 moves ahead. They think 9, 11, and upwards of 15, I'm sure more. I don't know, I'm not that good at chess. But they think far ahead, and they adjust accordingly. So the same is true. So that's what I mean by intellectual move, a move of the mind. To what extent am I conscious about the moves that I'm making? More often than not, we're just kind of moving around, just kind of going with the flow, right? And relying on chance, relying upon my own experience of how I've done things in the past, relying upon maybe my own, if it's there, cognitive ability to solve the problem. And there's a part of critical thinking that's knowing what you're doing. So thinking about your thinking in order to make your thinking better. Now, I asked this question here, and then think, well, what skills would I want? Just this one question to target. So I rewrote the question to make it a little clearer. It's like, there are 12 Christmas trees standing, and of those 5 are cut down. How many are left standing? Well, I think it's good to give students problems like this, because what's really are we asking them to do? 1, identify that an operation, that's subtraction. Easy enough, they can code, left as a key idea there. Then create an algorithm, and then follow through that algorithm, right? Accurate. It's important, but basic. What can we do, though, with this question, just to nudge, just move it in a slightly different direction, to where there's much more thinking? Well, that's the way we rewrote it. Susan said if there are 12 Christmas trees standing, and of those 5 are cut down, then 7 are left standing, but George says that's incorrect and 8 are left standing. Who's correct and why, and how did you arrive at your answer? What's the difference? The first one's focusing on an answer. The second one's focusing on the reasoning that informs the concept of subtraction. I'll never forget, I was teaching an economics class in high school, actually down in San Diego, at El Capitan High School. It was one of the schools I taught at down there. And I put up we had a supply and demand chart And it had fractions involved, and my students, seniors, were like, oh, fractions, blah. I'm like, well, okay. All right, what's a fraction? Give me a definition. Silence. I'm like, all right. Put a division symbol up on the board. It's like, what's that? And they're like, oh, division symbol? Oh, okay. Put a fraction next to it. What's that? Oh, fraction. What's the relationship between the two? Silence. I'm like, so they didn't see that math is a language. They didn't see that the two dots represent potential variables and it's telling you to do something. They weren't looking for the system. They saw fractions and thought of intellectual difficulty, rather than a method that's easily laying out what you need to do to figure out how to articulate this number sequence. And so by not looking at the system, they became intimidated. They didn't have a resource at play. They didn't have a method for entering into the problem. All right, so let me give you a high school example. How many of us, and just thinking about in our own educational experience, have had assignments like this, activities like this? As a group, discuss your reaction to Plato's Credo. I'm not necessarily saying Plato's the topic here, but just as a group, discuss. Well, what does that mean? Yeah, I really thought Plato's Credo was boring. All right, so how's the ball game? According to the prompt, that's a legitimate response. You're asking from everything from a person's judgment to a student's subjective interpretation or preference. Now, I'm not saying assignments like this are not important. They are. But I would say they're important if I give students the opportunity to think about what I'm asking them to do. So, rewrite it. In a group of 3, propose a list of significant questions you would like to have the teacher address or the class discuss regarding Plato's Credo. Your initial list, which you'll hand in, should include a dozen or so questions. Then reach consensus on what you consider your 3 best questions. Your recorder will write these questions on the board and explain to the class why your group considers them pertinent, interesting, and significant questions raised by the Credo. You have 15 minutes. What's the difference? Now, this really brings to mind here, when I go back to that question, like, what skills are we trying to foster? If I give them, well, discuss your reaction to Plato's Credo, I can't identify the skills. Unless I'm going to follow it up with an activity that says, all right, before you discuss, clarify how you're going to discuss it and what you're going to focus on, and so on and so forth. But that changes the prompt, right? So it reminds me of this story. It's not a story. It's this description. And I found out about this from a junior high school teacher. And she taught English, and she gave me this book entitled, I Read It, But I Can't Get It. But I Don't Get It, by Chris Tovani, a reading specialist out of Colorado. And it's just this one-page description, it's not a story, of 2 boys, and it's entitled The House. And it's 2 boys, I call them Bob and Tom, and they get school. Right? And so, Bob and Tom, so I give this to students, and they're to read it. And so Bob and Tom go back to Bob's house, and Bob says, oh yeah, this is my house, our closest neighbor is a couple acres away. We like our privacy, My parents just kind of give us a little bit more privacy, just have the yard re-landscaped with some nice tall hedges. That stone right there, that walkway, that's Italian stone, all the way from Italy. Now, if we go and a nice new irrigation system placed in so we can play, out in the grass, it's pretty nice. Now, the front door, it's always locked, and it has that little alarm sticker, but that's just a visual deterrent. There's really no alarm. But if we go around back, my parents always leave a key under the mat, so in case I get home before they do. Yeah, come on in. Oh, yeah. This is our kitchen. My parents just had it remodeled. Nice little Viking stove. Some nice tile. Now, that's my dad's office. He's a lawyer, and he has all, he reads a lot and all these books. And this is his desk, but I know he always keeps a little bit extra cash in that top right corner. So, this is walking up the hallway or whatever. Like, here's some paintings my parents just invested in. They like art. And, here's my mom's furs and jewels. Now, there's a leak in the roof. But they're going to get that fixed. And it just kind of goes on like that. So I give it to students. And I've used this as early as 5th grade. And I've used it as late as graduate school. And it works the same every time. So, okay, I want you to read it and highlight anything you think is important. So in one color, to highlight anything I think is important. Out of a class of, say, 45 students, I will get 45 different interpretations. Why? Because they're like, some kids will like highlight everything. Oh, I'm going to test them on this. Other kids will highlight nothing. Like, what's the point? You know, and everything in between, right? So I said, okay, now read it a second time. But this time, in a different color, highlight everything that's important and relevant to the point of view of a thief. What happens to that nice Italian stone walkway? That remodeled kitchen, that leaky roof, disappears. But the money, the alarm, the tall hedges, the jewels, all that stuff comes to the forefront. Now, 45 students will have 45 very similar highlights. So, okay, read it a third time. This time, I would like you to read it from the point of view of a person interested in buying the home. What's important and relevant? Money disappears. Alarm systems, all that stuff disappears. What comes to the forefront, you know, the roof, the remodel, all that stuff. Once again, 45 very similar highlights. So what's the point? I want to drive to students to get them to think about their thinking, to get them to think about what expectations and point of view do they bring into the classroom. So the point is a few fold. Number one, we always have to clarify our purpose. Whenever I sit down to do anything, I ask myself, why am I doing this and what am I trying to accomplish? Period. That's my first objective. Because our point of view, our own bias, it influences how we interpret the world. So I have to become aware of that. Because if my purpose is to read for pleasure, I'm going to read a lot differently than if my purpose is to read critically. Because if I read critically, I'm committed to making certain intellectual moves, asking certain questions, looking for certain concepts and defining them and comparing them, exploring implications, explicating the various relevant points of view, unpacking the assumptions. I'm committed to making these moves. I'm committed to having a dialogue with the author, right? Now, that's the first point. By the way, this came to me after reading a book when I was in graduate school. I thought I was a pretty good reader, right? I was getting A's in graduate school and college, and I thought I was pretty good until I read a book entitled How to Read a Book. It was 400 plus pages on how to read a book by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren. And I realized, wow, I really didn't know how to read. This is one of his key points, is clarify your purpose, right? If you're reading for enjoyment, you can read however you want. You may get something out of it, you may not. So, if my purpose is to read critically, then one of the moves I'm required to make is I have to read it from more than once. That's a novel idea to most students that I've ever dealt with, right? Thirdly, if my purpose is to read critically, I have to read it from multiple perspectives. Because each perspective is going to highlight certain information and shadow others. And I can't assume that my virtue of my own perspective, my one read, that I'm going to get it, I'm going to cover the spectrum. So, how does this relate then to what I might do in the classroom? Well, or at home for that matter? And one of the points that I like to make is that when my students enter the classroom, first and foremost, I have them write a letter. And that letter starts with the following prompt. The teacher's job is ... Second half of the letter, the student's job is ... And then I give it as a pre and post test. And if nothing has changed by the end of the semester, and I probably didn't do something effectively. It's questioning these assumptions, our own projections. And let me give you an at-home example. I live in this cabin, and our only source of heat is wood. And so I chop a lot of wood. And my wife, during my doctorate degree, my wife is finishing her master's degree, and I see her in the cabin reading. And I'm like, you know what? I've got a lot of reading to do. I'm out here chopping wood for both of us to keep us warm for the winter. And she should come out here and at least help me stack some of this wood so I can get to my reading. So I just keep just starts to snowball. Right? I'm like, I'm out here chopping wood for both of us to keep us warm for the winter. At least she should come out here and offer to help stack the wood. And finally, after who knows how much time passed, I yelled, I was like, Allie, and she comes out, she said, what? Said, I'm out here chopping wood for both of us to keep us warm for the winter. You're in there reading. I've got a lot of reading to do, and you know that. You're so selfish, you haven't even offered me a drink of water. And she said, you need to question your assumptions, Mr. Critical Thinker. I'm like, whoa. I'm too smart. You can't turn that around on me. You're too clever for that. And she's like, no, look, you were raised in a home that if you saw someone doing work and you did not help, you were punished. I was raised in a home with a maid. All you have to do is ask. So now I know when you're out here chopping wood, I'll offer you a drink of water. I get double slapped out of you. But that's the point, is how easy is it for our assumptions to go unquestioned. And theorists and educators across the curriculum say, at the very least, getting students to identify, that's the first step, and then assess the validity of their assumptions, it's huge. The assumptions that they bring into the classroom, those expectations. All of you come today with this list of expectations and presuppositions about what's going to be addressed. And it influences the way we see it. It influences what we're going to extrapolate from it. So if I want to take students that background knowledge and experience that's informing their classroom, and I want them to see it. And I want to position them in order to be a blank slate, so to speak, to write their own slate. So this is where I want to go now. I think when we're talking about critical thinking, we're going to address today, in a very abbreviated manner, what is it? I want us to walk away here with at least a couple foundational definitions, knowing that definitions have their limits. But also, why is it important? It's assumed regularly that critical thinking is important. And I've never met any reasonable people that would say it's not. But I have met many reasonable people who say it's a nice idea. But given our structures, given all of our politics, given everything we are expected to do, it's not feasible to foster. And so that leads us, what can we do about it? Now, I'm going to say teaching and learning. I'm going to apply that to my own house, too. I have a 3-year-old. She is awesome. And she is way smarter than I am, it seems. But what do I do? Not like I'm making an experiment out of her, but what can I do on a daily basis to help her figure things out for herself? And how can I support that? So, let's just take a moment. And given our time frame, I did pass out a poem, and I'm not going to have you read it right now. So just forget I passed it out. Forget I even said that. But what I would like to do is ask you this. What is your story? Meaning, say this was just a blank tablet up here, and you were to write your intellectual history on that board. How have you come to think critically? How have you come to command your thinking? What do you do when you reflect? Specifically, how do you reflect? How have you learned to generate questions? When you read critically, what do you do? What would be on your intellectual wall? What would you say you do? Now, in the classroom, when I have students do this, we begin to lay this out because it's going to create, much like that smart word dictionary, I do something called an intellectual journal, a learning log. And they're recording their thinking and their intellectual development throughout the course. So at the end of the course, they have a list of practical things they can do, questions they can ask. When I'm seeking clarification, I can ask a minimum of 4 questions. How do I define that? Could you state that in a different way? Could you give me an example, and can you provide me, say, an illustration, like a picture, a metaphor, an analogy? We're going to unpack that one in a second. But what do you do when you think critically? So I'll have them write it down, they'll have them get in groups, but for our purposes today, let's just briefly discuss that at your table. What do you do when you think well? What would you write up on your intellectual wall? So maybe partner up with one other person if possible. And just take a minute to share. reasons why I ask this question, these questions really, is that I find, whether it's at home or whether it's in the classroom, if I'm unable to explicate my thinking, take what I do intuitively or let's say implicitly well and make it explicit, the chances in my own personal life that I'm going to reproduce good thinking are diminished. Right? Also, the chances, the probability that I'll be able to turn it into something I can actually, a learning strategy, is also going to be diminished. So the first resource is to tap into our own thinking. What do we do well and how can I evidence that? So that we could reproduce it. One thing that took me a long time to learn how to do, and I still struggle with it at times, is to, instead of jumping to a conclusion, is to hypothesize. So one thing I have students do regularly is I'll take any fact taken out of a text or point that I'm bringing up in class. And a fact that I know students, they'll just accept. And I'll have them think of it not as a fact, but as a hypothesis. What happens to their thinking? If they think of it as a fact, it's an answer. And answers stop thinking. We want answers, right? But once you have a conclusion, it stops, and then maybe you can build on that. But a hypothesis, you're actually now, it's turning it back into a question. How do I know this is true? Let me give you an example. For 3 years, I was teaching a geography class, honors geography, and regular geography, college prep. And the first question I asked my students when they entered the class for these 3 years was, what is the shape of the Earth? 100% of my students over those 3 years said it was round or roundish, right? And I said, I'll accept that as true. Follow-up questions. How do you know that's true? How can you test to verify that that's true? And what does this knowledge help you do? Meaning, what questions can you generate based on this knowledge? What connections can you make with other knowledge? How does this knowledge help you think within the field of geography? Do you know how many students were able to touch? These are hundreds of students now. Touch any one of those 3 follow-up questions? 0. So it tells me that they had something that's true, and unfortunately, it was inert information. I can tell you there's 110 ridges on the edge of a diagram. I can tell you who invented the ridging system and why, right? But unless I'm on Jeopardy, right, what is that knowledge beneficial for? So there's oftentimes this claim that, well, I can't teach students to think critically because they have to have all the information before they do it. Well, I think back to Aristotle when he said, what we need to learn, we learn by doing. When I learned how to ride a bike, I didn't read a manual on a bike and then jump on it, right? No, I was learning as I was going. I'm not saying reading a manual wouldn't have been beneficial, but there's this claim, though, that having the information in a superficial way prepares you to apply it. And that's actually not true. It's inert. It's dead in one's mind. Students had this fact. And I told them, your thinking is just like those in medieval Europe who were told that the earth is flat. It's just you happen to have something that's true. But you're merely regurgitating what someone has told you, so it has no real substance or meaning. You don't know why it is the way it is. So you're unable to make connections. So what we want to do is move students toward an activated knowledge. Knowledge where they know what it is and why it is and how it connects with other things. The third here, just as a point, is activated ignorance. That's when you think something is true, but it's really not. So it's true and it guides your behavior. Stereotypes, racism. These are just some large examples of that. Now, because what we see is this phenomenon. This comes out of a novel entitled The Magnificent Ambersons. And this really resonates. I like this. It resonates with me because this was me. It said he had learned how to pass examinations by cramming. That is, in 3 or 4 days and nights, he could get into his head enough of a selected fragment of some scientific or philosophical, literary, or linguistic subject to reply plausibly to 6 questions out of 10. He could retain the information necessary for such a feat just long enough to give a successful performance, and then it would evaporate utterly from his brain. Now this last little part is what really catches, right? And leave him undisturbed. Education should be disturbing. Not in like a horror movie kind of way, but in a way where it mixes up the waters of our minds. Like that, it mixes our point of view. It has us look at things from a different lens. Because every discipline is a lens by which to interpret the world. It's a network of questions and assumptions and methods. And I say this was me because as early as I can remember, from first, second grade, and definitely in the high school, I was a gamesman. I knew how to play the game of learning. I knew how to get very good grades. Unfortunately, I just admitted this at a conference earlier this year. I made it through high school, well, let's say junior high and high school, with A's in English and AP English, and I never read one book. I never went to the library, and this was pre-internet, right? I knew that I scored the highest on a district exam on Julius Caesar and grammar. If anyone reads my writing, you got to kind of laugh at that. The grammar test, I scored the highest on that. Well, I knew that all I had to do is ask the instructor the right questions, and I'd get all the answers for the exams. Now, consequently, what happened? I went to college, and I went to a good college, and I realized very quickly I couldn't read, I couldn't write, I couldn't speak, I didn't do anything with any skill. And so I don't want my students to learn the same way I was learning. I'm not necessarily blaming the teaching, I'm sure there had something to do with it, but I don't want to allow them to play those games. So I want them to think about their thinking, because this is how we tend as humans to look at our world. We compartmentalize, and it's very effective for us to do so, right? We put everything in this nice little package, right? And humans are very efficient thinkers. We want the greatest amount of gain with the least amount of investment, right? Least amount of cost. But that kind of creates a sense of intellectual rigidity at times. And so when students enter in the classroom, oh, Monday's class is here, oh, Tuesday's class is over here, or week 1, or week 11, or here's biology, and here's English, or here's just science, and here's history. Everything's disconnected. Here's my family life, here's my friends, It's just everything's disconnected. But I want them to see, as far as content goes, it's not disconnected. It's a network of interconnected meanings, right? This is highlight anything you think is important, right? This is create a system and enter into it from a certain point of view, right? Look for the connections, because there's always, in every discipline, central concepts that lead to secondary and tertiary and peripheral concepts, and I can take any point out here and understand it through its interior circles. That's one way to develop it. Because I hear oftentimes that I have too much content to cover in too little time. Well, there's a reality to the idea. But when I hear that, and I hear that regularly at the high school and in the, at every level, but at the college level it's paramount, I say, well, if that's what you think, you're actually using the word content erroneously. Content is this. Content is meaning. It's a network of meanings. What they really mean is I have too much information to cover. If that's your job's easy. Here's the book, I'll see you at the midterm. Right? Here's the book. Yeah, well, you have a couple tests, just read and study. If you don't know how to read, well, I'll help you do that first. I mean, it's pretty simple, but if we want students to think critically about the information they receive, they have to understand it as a system of a network of meanings. And let me give you an example, a home example. So, one thing I'm trying to do with my little girl, and it's frustrating for me because what I want to do, I want to solve all her problems for her, right? And I know that's not how she's going to learn things. Watching her struggle just tears me up. And whether it's doing puzzles or, she's trying to figure out a new motor skill. Recently, we were playing in our creek, and we were pretending like we were fishing. There's no real fish in that creek, right? And I found in the mud bank this fish toy head, right? So I snuck it on the end of her hook, right? And I said, Hazel, you know, pull it in. And she just, I mean, she pulled in, her eyes were huge. Just, how on earth did that get on? Now, I was like, how'd that happen? She's like, I don't know. I was like, well, what do you think? And she begins constructing all these different scenarios. She was not amazed that a fish was on her hook. I thought that was interesting. She didn't think it wasn't an issue of it's a plastic fish. For her, it was like a real fish. That wasn't the thing she was focused on. But rather, how did it get on her hook, and why was it only the head? That's really what she was curious about, right? And so she begins constructing all these explanations, and finally she says, well, maybe. And everyone, I was like, well, you think that it's really possible, that, feasible? And she's like, yeah. Then she finally said, well, we saw that crawdad. Maybe the fish bit on, the crawdad came up and ate the rest of the fish, and all you have is the head left. I'm like, that's a good hypothesis. And she's like, yeah, that's a good hypothesis. This carries on. And I wasn't going to give her the answer, but I just want to give her the opportunity to kind of think about, what is the problem at issue? How can I possibly explain this? And then eventually, as she gets older, maybe can we develop some way of verifying it? And I think that that's the point. I begin every class as a question to be answered. Even at home when I'm discussing my wife and we have a problem, I'm like, well, let's clarify the problem. What's the question we're trying to answer? What are the network of questions that we need to answer to really work through this? Rather than just highlight anything you think is important, right? So this is a problem and we think it's a significant issue, let's figure it out. Because if our students aren't trying to reason through something, then I seriously question the amount of criticality that's embedded in their thinking. Now, we often talk about critical thinking as solving problems, and that is definitely true. But it's also relevant to identifying problems. This author that is one of my favorite authors and scholars, his name is David Perkins. He's at Harvard, and he wrote this book entitled Making Learning Whole recently, and I was reading it, and in this book he talks about how he went to MIT in mathematics. From what I understand, you got to be pretty smart in mathematics. And he was at MIT, and he said he went through all his doctoral work, coursework, successful, right? And he got time to do his dissertation. And his professors, his committee, was like, all right, now you got to find a problem. And he said, wow, I realized that I have only solved problems that were given to me. I'm very fluent at solving problems given to me. But I've never found a problem. He's like, I never thought mathematically as a mathematician. So that's one question I pose to instructors, is like, what does it mean to think mathematically at a third grade level, the kindergarten level? What type of questions are they asking? What observations are they making? Are they evaluating the clarity of their questions? How are they constructing that knowledge? So we're not teaching them to think like scientists. We're teaching them to play like, it's like a Little League version, right? They're not in the majors, but they're playing by the rules. They're playing the game. They're playing a variety of problems and teams kind of thing, right? They're engaged in the process. But it's true that a student can take science and never learn the importance of scientific thinking or assumptions that inform it. So, or whether it's history or English, whatever it may be. And one thing that I really want to just point out here then is when I think of critical thinking, I don't think it is something that's added to what we do. I teach critical thinking every other Friday. Last 10 minutes of class, that's our critical thinking time. But our textbooks are arranged that way, right? Chapter review, identification questions 1 through 20, comprehension questions 1 through 10, critical thinking questions 1 through 10, right? It assumes that you can identify something and make it relevant and understand its significance without having constructed it critically. And it's true, you can. You can do it superficially, that inert knowledge, that inert information. But this is traditional Bloom's, where they say critical thinking is the top 3 levels, right? This is the new Bloom's. This word says create, this one says remember. But this leads to an argument where I'm having a hard time just getting my students to remember stuff, so we're never going to have them evaluate or analyze stuff. Well, the majority of people, the overwhelming majority of people that I hear say those types of things, instructors primarily, have never read the book. The book paints a much more robust picture. They'll refer to the diagram here, but they will not. They necessarily haven't read the book. And the book paints something, so I like to rethink it like this. In order to remember, we have to apply and evaluate, create, and analyze. We understand by analyzing it, by working with it, by contextualizing it. So when we say, I don't have time to teach students to think critically, I'm saying we're limited by our own imaginations. So here's a little activity that I think is very important. I'm going to give you an abbreviated version. Okay? What I would like you to do is I would like you to, if you have a piece of paper, write down your definition of critical thinking. Now, I would like you to write it, though, in the following way. If I was just to say, write down your definition of critical thinking, I bet it's kind of like highlighting things important, right? And that's a necessary step. If I was in the classroom, I'd have them write it just their own definition. Follow it up with something that's more focused, right? That they'll have to think about the process. So as you write your definition, I want you to write it the following way. I want you to define it in your own words. I want you then to elaborate. So start the next sentence, in other words, ... Then I want you to give an example. I think critically when ... To develop that, you can give a counterexample too. I failed to think critically when. Right? But give an example. And then if you can, provide an illustration. Like an analogy or metaphor, a simile, a graph, a chart, a cartoon. So I can think of it this way. Critical thinking is like an ocean. Where the ocean you see a lot of things on the surface, but as soon as you go down, you begin to see a lot more things and discover many new things and also connections. The further you go down, the more you see, the more interconnected you see that it is, and also it's difficult. Pressure, right? Difficult to go down. Or one that I've heard was introduced to me, and I've heard often, it might be abused at this point, but critical thinking is like an onion, right? It's the whole thing's critical thinking and many layers to it. The more you shave away, the deeper you get into the problem, towards its core, but also makes you cry, right? It takes work. So if you can, think of like an illustration. Critical thinking is like finding your own way there, right? Using a map to figure out your directions rather than maybe a GPS telling you how to get there. So anyways, just take a moment. Say, elaborate, exemplify, illustrate. Just take a moment to do this ourselves. But I'd like you to switch roles. But before we do so, what did you notice about the directions that I gave B? I said ask A questions, right? Highlight anything you think is important. Well, there's value in that. When I'm working with instructors and they say, "Oh, we have collaborative learning, we have to think, fair, share," they oftentimes just put students into groups and leave it up to the students to define the task at hand. How to actually question. I'm not going to assume that my students know how to ask relevant, probing questions. So I have to give them a lens to enter into their questions. Right? And so now I would like A to question B. B, read what you wrote. And in the classroom, I want to have them actually read what they wrote, because there's an extent to which the quality of our writing reflects the quality of our thinking. If my writing's unclear, then part of my thinking may be unclear, right? So they read what they're own, then in this case, A is going to question B, focusing on a couple standards. The standard of clarity and the standard of depth. Now, if the concept of clarity that word, that thinking word, is active in your mind. I mean, it's substantively understood. It's a tool. It's a resource. Which means, at the very least, you can ask a few questions. Can you define that? Can you give me another different definition? Could you give me an example? Ground it in real-life experience, please. It's too abstract. Could you provide me the illustration? Tell me what it's like. Right? Connect it to a transfer. Connect it to something outside of this domain. Those are 4 questions you can always ask. So when I put students into groups, they know, and I say, I want you to question for clarity, they know that these are a few questions they can always ask. Right? It becomes a tool, a resource that I'm going to challenge them to use substantively. And finally, like, the concept of depth is another standard. What makes this a complex issue? You said analyze. Well, what's the relationship between analyze and evaluate? Well, do we ever analyze? Can I analyze something and not necessarily understand how it works? So what's the purpose of analyzing something? Look for the complexities implicit within the issue. So now, B is going to read to A, and A will question B. Focused on the standard of clarity and depth. All right? Let's begin. So, going back to that idea of a learned log, this is something like this strategy here, something I want students to be explicitly aware of. It's in their log. They're practicing it every day. Whether we're dealing with a complex idea, a new idea, or something that they think like they understand. So, for example, say the word of a friend. You have BFFs all day, and they change all the time, right? Facebook has like exploded the concept of a friend, right? Students really, they use the word all the time, and they use it accurately within contexts, appropriate contexts. But do they understand the word? Meaning, do they understand the implications of it? Can a teacher be your friend? If so, how's that different than, say, my own age, a peer? Can a parent be a friend? Are there conditions I put under friendship? Would I be a friend with somebody that hurt others? What does it mean to, it's kind of exploring some of these questions. Words they use, we take for granted. And so, I want students at any point to be able to enter into their thinking. This was from a 2nd grade classroom. And to clarify, it becomes a tool when they're able to use it. So to clarify means to ask questions to understand something. When I don't understand something someone says, I can ask questions like, could you repeat that? Could you repeat that? I couldn't hear you. Could you explain that differently? Could you give me an example? Now granted, we have some work to do, right? But they're moving in the direction. Here's another one. This comes from the same class. To clarify means to switch the words to make sure everybody can understand. When I don't understand something someone says, and that was the prompt, I can ask questions like, can you say that in other words? What do you mean by that? I don't know that word. And ask if it's, summarize, I think is it, and ask if it's correct. Can you repeat that? In the bottom it says, I don't understand how you explain it. So the point is that even in daily conversations, whether it's with my graduate school students, or whether it's with my wife, or whether it's with my 3-year-old, we're holding ourselves to a standard. Now I'm giving a very simple conception of critical thinking here, and I promise I give you a definition. Let me give you just one just for clarification. Critical thinking can be conceived as disciplined, self-guided thinking aimed at living a well-reasoned life. And what that means is, I don't care what you believe, I care how you've come to it. Right? I don't care. I want to know what's your reasoning behind it. Now, if it doesn't influence others, you can believe purple dinosaurs are walking around here right now. I don't care. But as soon as you tell me I have to believe that, or it's true, now you're inviting a dialogue. You're asking me to ask probing questions, give reasons. And so it's thinking that does indeed analyze itself. But what does analyze mean? Look at its purposes. What's the author's purpose? What are the questions the author is trying to answer? Right? What is the context at play? What information does the author use to come to his or her conclusions? What are they taking for granted? What are their assumptions? What am I assuming? What's my point of view, and what are the relevant points of view at play? The Berenstein Bear has trouble with pets. What's the point of view of the kids versus the point of view of the mother versus the point of view of the father? If we were to think of that thinking as types, who's being fair-minded? Who's being selfish? Who's being naive? Breaking the thinking down in a systematic way, in a questioning way. It's thinking that holds itself to standards. So I want you to be clear versus unclear. I want you to be relevant versus not relevant. I want you to probe depth instead of the superficial. Right? There's so many standards, and they all link back to those thinking words, that academic vocabulary. But using a few well is so much more useful and important and valuable than using many poorly. But I think these last two dimensions really resonate. I said that word a couple times now. But it's the idea of developing in itself an intellectual habit, a behavior, a disposition. To what extent do I think with intellectual humility? I'm aware of the limits of my own knowledge. To what extent do I systematically enter and consciously enter into the points of view of others before judging it? To understand it before I judge it, intellectual empathy. To what extent do I allow evidence to define what I believe rather than tradition, confidence, and reason? To what extent am I intellectually rigid and I want to hold on to my belief system rather than challenge it or think of it in an alternative way, intellectual flexibility? Because what these ideas point to is this last dimension, that we are reasoning beings. But our reasoning is oftentimes influenced by our own egocentric or sociocentric or even ethnocentric tendencies. Egocentricity. I'm Enoch Kale and I'm the center of all truth. I'm glad you laughed because it's not true. It's ridiculous. Right? But we have a tendency at times to ignore the standards of being clear, of being intellectually transparent, to advance our own agenda. Right? I can be skilled at thinking critically, but do so to pursue my own selfish ends. Right? Like when I mentioned the Booth-Tarkington thing and my high school experience. I considered myself an elite, now I consider myself an elite disabled learner. I was good at a game to pursue my own selfish ends. I was good at manipulating data. I was not good at allowing the problem to define. Right? And because instead of intellectual standards, what often do we use in our thinking? Standards like this. And there's many more, of course. But it's true because I want to believe it's true. Or because we believe it to be true. Or because it's true because, and true is italicized, meaning it's not verifiable, right? It's just what you believe it to be. Because because I've always believed it that way. Or I want to believe it. I've had a few relationships fall into this one. Yeah, she loves me. It's self-deceptive behavior. Now, what this points to, again, is that our thinking, it can either trap us or it can free us. If it traps us, it's holding us hostage. And I like that idea of hostage because I'm a passive recipient rather than an active participant. My life's being defined for me rather than I'm thinking about my own thinking and taking responsibility for it. But it'll be held, it actually says down here, you can't see it, but it says, they'll hold me hostage with then uncritically held beliefs. Versus, if it frees us, it's opening our minds up to new ways of thinking. And when we talk about 21st century skills, we talk about a lot of very valuable ideas. And these ideas are only useful when I can ground them in concrete applications. Otherwise, it's just abstract. We won't see education transforming our kids, but rather maintaining the status quo. And so, as you support your instructors and schools and at home, think about what it is that you want to result from any particular action or task that you give your kids. So, for example, it's a question I ask myself when I'm designing lessons. I say, for every lesson, for every course, for every assignment, for every activity, I ask myself, what's the intellectual product I want to result from this? Product meaning what skill, what insight, what disposition. And if I can't answer that, then I'm not going to, chances that I'm actually going to help students develop it, pretty low. And so at home, even when I'm sitting down doing a puzzle with my kid, and it's driving me crazy, right? Just watching her struggle, because she's just now getting the concept of borders, right? I'm thinking, all right, what is it that I want her to help develop, or what skill or insight do I want to come to? And that's what we'll focus on. So, critical thinking isn't something that is for the elite only. Rather, it is what can be accomplished by anyone who seeks to discipline their thinking. And our responsibility is to maximize those opportunities students have to look at problems and think through them consciously and systematically with a view to improve their thinking within it. So for every class they enter, what is the role of the student? What does it mean to be a skilled learner versus an unskilled learner? What type of questions do skilled learners ask? All right, you've written those down. Let's agree on some. These are questions that you have to ask now in class. I'm holding you to that standard. What problems and questions do you have when you enter into my classroom? Every day you should have a question. If you don't have a question, that's a problem. I'll even stop class and I'll say, okay, I'd like everyone to take a minute and write down a question you have about anything we've addressed thus far. I'll give you 1 minute. If you need help, I'll help you. But if you don't have a question, write down the following. I'm not thinking well enough to have a question. There's a sense in which I want to own when my thinking is doing well, and I want to also acknowledge when my thinking is poor so that I can correct it. I want the idea of identifying my weaknesses as a strength. Making mistakes is okay if I seek to correct it. And by the way, comment on education in the United States, yeah, many documented problems, but the same is true in all the work that I've done in Singapore, work that I've done in Africa, work that I've done with instructors in Malaysia, Indonesia, work that I've done with instructors in Hong Kong. Yes, students are performing at a high level, but they also have the same problems that we do. The expectations of just rote regurgitation are still paramount. Didactic instruction, where I just lecture, I give you knowledge, right? That's still, I don't want to be I give you knowledge. No, I give you problems. I'm going to help you find problems. So know that this is like an onion. There's a lot we can do. I appreciate your time and good luck.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I know that the leaders at the back have been in here and need to get back, but I'd love to open it up if anyone has some time. Questions for the leaders or questions for Dr. Hill. I think that everyone can hear if you just want to stand up, Jenny, over there.
I always ask my kids when they come home from school, which I got from reading about I think it was Marie Curie's mother would ask her when she came home from school, not what did you learn today, but did you ask a good question? One good question. And my kids, they tend to always say the same thing. Well, nobody asked me a question. Or it didn't seem like I could ask a question. And you know, that thing with so much content to cover. And I just wonder, you know, would you say, my question is, would you say that the mechanism really for getting the kids to think more critically, to think, and to really learn to think would be either just the teachers asking more questions, or, you know, if we we had to choose one, for instance, we still don't feel like we have the time. The teacher's asking more questions, more open-ended questions, or kids maybe sitting in discussion groups and asking each other questions. And
I do my best to get students to develop questioning skills. I want them to ask the questions. I ask a lot of questions for sure, so I don't think it's either or for sure. But I'm going to lean toward providing opportunities for students to ask questions. And to address the problem that, say, it began with, one thing I like to do at the end of a lesson is I say, okay, it's a minute paper. You have 1 minute to write a paper. You're going to answer 2 prompts. 1, what's the most significant thing you've learned today? Now, kids can BS that pretty quickly, right? So the second question, what questions remain unanswered for you? So I'm not asking them to just come up with any old question. I'm framing the question. So if I say to a student, like, what questions did you ask today? It's too general. It's like highlighting anything you think is important. It's like, well, what questions did you ask today that probed point of view? What questions did you ask today that remain unanswered for you? What problems were posed that you didn't solve? What questions did you ask today for clarification? So I'm giving them a lens because otherwise it's too abstract. So those little tweaks can lend itself to a lot more things.
My daughter came home about a couple of weeks ago, and she actually, was very insightful to me. She basically said, Mom, I'm going to start asking more questions in class. She said, people really don't like to ask questions because there's a boy that always asks questions in class, and everybody gives him this look, and everybody always thinks he's so stupid, but he gets straight A's. But because of the perceived attention that anybody that asks questions doesn't get it and they're stupid, kids tend to not ask questions. I think a critical component to having kids ask questions is making it an environment so that they could speak openly, whether it's starting off with breaking them up into smaller groups and having discussion groups and then taking that discussion groups and opening it up to the bigger class until they get comfortable being able to ask questions. But, to me, I have always told her, if you don't understand it, you should ask the instructor. Well, when she came home and said that, and she said, I said, yeah, because nobody's going to remember that you were the good girl that sat there that didn't ask those questions. And, and that guy that did ask the questions is now going to